Hello, and welcome to Unbuilt Giants, a series that looks at the development and demise of some of history's most notable and sometimes bizarre skyscraper projects. The Cenotaph for Newton, proposed in Paris by Étienne-Louis Boullée in 1784, is one of the most extraordinary unbuilt projects in the history of architecture. Conceived as a memorial to Sir Isaac Newton, it was not intended merely to honor a distinguished scientist through inscription, ornament, or conventional monumental form. Instead, Boullée attempted something vastly more ambitious: to translate Newton's intellectual achievement into architecture itself. The project brought together Enlightenment thought, the emotional power of the sublime, the severe discipline of neoclassicism, and a poetic treatment of light and shadow that made the design seem less like a tomb than an image of the cosmos. Though never realized, it became a defining statement of architecture as an art of ideas, and its influence has endured far beyond the conditions of its own time. The proposal emerged from the particular world of late 18th century Paris, where Boullée lived and worked from 1728 until his death in 1799. Paris, during his lifetime, was both the cultural center of Europe and a city under immense strain. Before Haussmann's 19th century remaking of its streets, it was a place of dense urban fabric, social inequality, financial crisis, and rising political tension. Poor harvests and expensive wars had placed severe pressure on the kingdom, while Enlightenment ideas about reason, sovereignty, natural rights, and the reform of society were spreading with increasing force. Newton, by this point long dead, had come to stand for precisely those Enlightenment ideals: rational inquiry, the discovery of universal laws, and the triumph of human intelligence over superstition and ignorance. In France, where Newton's ideas had been widely disseminated and admired, he had become more than an English scientist. He had become a near-mythic figure of reason itself. Boullée's Cenotaph must be understood in this context. It was a French architect's monumental homage to a thinker whose discoveries had reshaped humanity's conception of the universe and whose fame had, by the second half of the 18th century, assumed almost symbolic proportions. Boullée himself was ideally placed to produce such a work. Although he completed some modest-built commissions for private and religious patrons, his greatest importance in his own lifetime lay in his role as a teacher and theorist, especially at the École nationale des ponts et chaussées and the Académie royale d'architecture. He rejected the decorative frivolity of Rococo architecture and sought instead an architecture of pure, severe, elemental forms. He admired the Greeks and Romans, but he also looked beyond them to earlier and more archaic monumental traditions. What distinguished him was not simply reverence for antiquity, but the radical way in which he abstracted and enlarged its principles. He stripped architecture back to geometry, mass, proportion, and atmosphere. In his view, architecture was not fundamentally the practical art of construction, as Vitruvius had held, but first and foremost an act of conception. Before building came imagination. The true essence of architecture for Boullée lay in the creation of forms capable of expressing ideas, arousing emotion, and embodying universal truths. The Cenotaph for Newton was perhaps the clearest demonstration of that philosophy. The background to the monument, therefore, lies not in an ordinary building commission, but in Boullée's larger intellectual project. The Cenotaph was one of a number of visionary designs he developed in the later part of his career, and included in his treatise Architecture, Essai sur l'Art, composed roughly between the late 1770s and late 1780s. This manuscript, though left to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, was not published during his lifetime and only became widely known much later, especially after its 20th century publication and translation. The Newton project was thus, from the outset, a theoretical and artistic work rather than a practical proposal destined for immediate execution. It served as a manifesto of what architecture could become if liberated from constraints of economy, program, engineering feasibility, and client demands. That does not mean it lacked seriousness. On the contrary, Boullée approached it as a profound act of commemoration. A cenotaph, by definition, is a tomb for someone buried elsewhere, and Newton's actual remains were in England. Yet that very distance seems to have intensified the monument's symbolic purpose. Boullée was not designing a literal burial place, but a cosmic memorial, one in which the architecture itself would become an analogue of Newton's universe. Central to the proposal was Boullée's conviction that the sphere was the most perfect of all forms. He described it as the natural body that combined strict symmetry, regularity, and variety in the highest degree, and he believed that the effects of light across its curved surface held an immeasurable power over the senses. The sphere, for him, was not simply a geometric preference, but a philosophical choice. It signified perfection, wholeness, celestial order, and natural law. It was therefore entirely appropriate for Newton, the thinker who had explained the motions of heavenly bodies and helped define the shape and order of the physical world. Boullée's own description of the project makes clear that he wanted Newton to be enveloped by his own discovery, enclosed within the image of the cosmos he had revealed. In this sense, the monument was both literal and metaphorical, a gigantic sphere for the scientist of universal gravitation and celestial mechanics. The design itself was of astonishing scale. Boullée proposed a hollow sphere approximately 500 feet, or about 150 meters in diameter, making it taller than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The sphere was embedded within, or rather appeared to be partially buried in, a three-tiered circular or cylindrical base, producing a strange and powerful visual effect. The monument seemed at once grounded and hovering, both emerging from and sinking into the earth. Boullée completed the perceived form of the sphere with flanking curved ramps, an intelligent compositional device that helped the eye read the buried mass as a whole body. Around the base, he arranged dense rings of cypress trees, the tree long associated in Greek and Roman tradition with mourning, death, and memorialization. Their presence softened the abstract geometry of the monument while also intensifying its funerary symbolism. In Boulée's drawings, the tiny scale of the trees and the minuscule human figures heighten the overwhelming size of the sphere, making the visitor seem almost negligible beside the idea commemorated. Approach to the monument was ceremonial and emphatically choreographed. A single grand staircase led to a circular plinth before the main body of the cenotaph. Boulée's drawings, however, are not conventionally descriptive architectural documents. They privilege mood, grandeur, and atmospheric effect over practical clarity. Certain aspects of access appear ambiguous. For instance, some drawings indicate a small exterior door above a crenellated band on the second level, yet no clear means of reaching it is shown. Narrow exterior stairs on the flanks seem to connect the second and uppermost terraces, but overall legibility is subordinate to emotional and visual impact. This is characteristic of Boulée's method. He was less concerned with resolving the building as a utilitarian object than with presenting it as a complete poetic vision. Entry into the sphere itself took place through a lower-level portal that opened into a long, dark, tunnel-like passage excavated beneath the central volume. This subterranean approach was crucial to the monument's effect. Visitors did not simply step into a chamber. They underwent a process of transition. The tunnel ran below the massive hollow sphere and then rose gradually as one moved inward. At the end, a final flight of steps led up into the very center of the interior void. There, placed at the center of gravity and serving almost as the sole marker of human measure, was Newton's sarcophagus. The contrast was deliberate and dramatic, an almost infinitesimal tomb in the middle of an immense cosmic cavity. Boullée understood that scale works most powerfully through contrast. The monument's grandeur depended not only on its vast dimensions, but on the stark disproportion between human body, tomb, and architectural envelope. The interior was the most radical part of the design and the clearest expression of Boullée's architectural imagination. He conceived it as an inversion of ordinary light conditions, producing two opposed experiences corresponding to day and night. During the day, the interior would be dark, like a nocturnal sky. Tiny perforations in the thick shell of the sphere would admit points of daylight, arranged so as to correspond to the locations of planets and constellations. The result would be the illusion of standing inside an immense, star-filled firmament. This was an astonishing idea, a monumental interior transformed into a model of the heavens through controlled punctures of light. It effectively made the cenotaph into a proto-planetarium long before the modern planetarium dome existed. The darkness would not be accidental, but total, a solemn, enveloping blackness in which the stars of daylight appeared as distant celestial points. The visitor would thus experience Newton's achievement not through explanatory text, but through immersion in a spatial metaphor of the universe he had deciphered. At night, the effect would reverse. Suspended at the center of the sphere was to be an enormous, luminous object, described variously as a spherical lamp or celestial luminaire, vaguely resembling an armillary form. This artificial sun would radiate light through the dark interior and along the entry passage, turning the void into a glowing cosmic chamber. Boullée therefore devised a building whose meaning depended on inversion. Day would produce night, and night would produce an artificial day. This play of opposites was entirely consistent with his wider fascination with polarity, light, shadow, brilliance, obscurity, and emotional atmosphere. He believed that light could stir contradictory sensations, from joy to melancholy, and that the architect should manipulate such effects with poetic intent. In the Cenotaph for Newton, illumination was not a secondary technical matter, but the very substance of the memorial's symbolic life. The monument's surfaces and details were intentionally austere. Boullée rejected applied ornament and relied instead on pure mass, smooth geometries, and tonal contrasts. The bare walls, the colossal void, and the absence of decorative distraction all contributed to a somber and mysterious impression. In section, the drawings suggest an intuitive understanding of structure, with the shell seeming to thin as it rises and thicken towards its supports, though the project was not developed as a realistic engineering scheme. There is also an enigmatic corridor or ring passage around the perimeter, quarter-circular in section and apparently difficult to access, adding yet another layer of spatial ambiguity. fog-like tonal washes in the drawings reinforce the sensation that one is looking not merely at a building, but at an atmosphere of awe, melancholy, and cosmic silence. Boullée's architecture of shadow, inspired in part by his reflections on nature and the emotional effects of darkness, is nowhere more evident than here. As a work of development, the Cenotaph belongs to Boullée's mature period, when he was refining an architecture grounded in pure bodies, such as spheres, cylinders, and cones. It also stands within the broader movement later described as revolutionary neoclassicism or visionary neoclassicism, associated with Boulée, Claude-Nicolas Ledoux, and Jean-Jacques Lecoeur. Yet, the Newton Cenotaph is singular even within that company because of its extraordinary fusion of geometry, emotion, and symbolism. It is both architecture parlante, or speaking architecture, and something more abstract. It speaks through form alone. Nothing in the design narrates Newton's biography. There are no allegorical sculptures, no crowded reliefs, no triumphal inscriptions. Instead, the sphere, the darkness, the stars, the immense scale, and the solitary tomb communicate the meaning. The building does not illustrate Newton's work, it attempts to become a spatial equivalent of it. The specifications usually associated with the project underscore how far Boulée was willing to push architectural thought beyond conventional limits. The sphere was approximately 150 meters or 500 feet in diameter. It rose from a vast circular stepped base, was ringed by hundreds of cypress trees, and enclosed a single, monumental interior chamber whose scale far exceeded any practical commemorative requirement. It was proposed for Paris, though never assigned a site in the pragmatic modern sense of a developed urban project. The surviving drawings, now held by the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, include exterior views, elevations, plans, and sections showing both the day and night interior effects. These drawings were executed in ink and wash, and their representational power was essential to the project's life. Because the building was never constructed, the drawings themselves became the architecture's primary mode of existence. The question of why the Cenotaph was never built has several answers, all of them important. First, it was not conceived as a normal commission with a client, budget, and construction process in place. It functioned chiefly as an ideal project and architectural manifesto. Boulée was explicitly interested in the freedom of conception, in demonstrating what architecture could imagine when released from immediate practical constraints. Second, the proposal was of a scale and technical ambition that would have been extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, to realize in the circumstances of late 18th century France. A hollow sphere of such vast dimensions, with its controlled lighting effects and massive supporting base, would have posed immense structural, material, logistical, and financial challenges. Third, the political and economic conditions of France were increasingly unstable. The years around the project's conception were marked by severe national strain, and within a few years, the French Revolution would transform every institution of patronage and public building. In such a context, a gigantic memorial to an English scientist, however admired as a figure of Enlightenment reason, was unlikely to find the practical support necessary for execution. Finally, the Cenotaph may never have been intended for literal construction at all. Its function was to exist in the realm of ideas, where it could operate with greater purity and force than any compromised built version might have done. In that sense, its unbuilt status is not simply a failure of realization, but part of its meaning. Yet the fact that it remained unbuilt did not diminish its historical importance. Boullée had the drawings engraved and circulated, and they became widely known in professional and artistic circles. Although his treatise was not published until much later, the project contributed to his posthumous reputation as one of architecture's great visionary figures. Along with the work of Ledoux and Lecoeur, it influenced architectural thought in the 19th century, especially within traditions linked to the École des Beaux-Arts. In the 20th century, Boullée was rediscovered with renewed enthusiasm, and the Cenotaph in particular came to be seen as a precursor to modern architectural abstraction, monumentality, and conceptual design. Critics and historians have regarded it as perhaps the supreme example of architecture existing as drawing, theory, and idea, rather than as constructed object. Its impact can be traced in later architects who explored pure form and metaphysical monumentality, and it has continued to inspire reinterpretations, including projects such as Lebbeus Woods's Cenotaph for Einstein. What makes the Cenotaph for Newton endure is not simply its scale or strangeness, but its clarity of ambition. Boullée sought to make architecture capable of expressing the largest possible ideas: nature, infinity, death, knowledge, and the sublime. In Newton, he found a subject worthy of such treatment, a figure whose scientific discoveries seemed to demand an architecture commensurate with the cosmos itself. The resulting project, with its colossal sphere, subterranean procession, star-pierced darkness, suspended inner sun, and severe funerary grove of cypresses, remains one of the most compelling attempts ever made to turn thought into form. It was never built because it belonged to a domain larger than building alone, the realm of architectural imagination at its most ambitious. Even so, or perhaps because of that, it has survived as one of the most powerful monuments architecture has ever produced. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and consider subscribing for more episodes coming soon. See you next time.